Hi, this is Mike Billington. I'm with the Executive Intelligence Review and the Schiller Institute. I'm here with Professor Richard Sakwa. For the second time, we've had the opportunity to interview this very brilliant scholar. He is a Russia scholar, and Russia and Ukraine, given the circumstances, are part of what he's written extensively about. He's a prolific writer, and we'll mention several of the books that he's written over the years in the course of this interview. And he recently is retired, as I understand it, right?
Yeah.
Recently retired from the University of Kent, where he was actually head of the university for a while, I
No,
believe.
head of the department, head of school.
Head of
Yeah,
the school.
not of the university. No.
Okay. But a longtime professor and head of the school there. But he's recently retired and devoting his time to writing, which we'll also discuss in the context of the interview. Do you want to say anything else about your history?
No, that's the main thing in many ways. But just to say that, yes, I focused on Russian politics, but in by force of necessity over the last decade or so, I've been working more on international politics and international affairs, which, of course, bouncing between Russia and international affairs, given the developments in world politics. In my view, you couldn't understand one in many ways without the other. So that's the only gloss I'd add to what you said.
Okay, well, Professor Sakwa became very well known most recently with the publication of a book called Frontline Ukraine, published just months after the 2014 coup against the elected government in Ukraine, the so-called Maidan color revolution, which played a significant role in exposing the fake news about the so-called heroic Democratic People's Revolt, which is still the myth peddled in the West about what the Ukraine government is, which was actually imposed on the country by the Obama administration, with the Vice President Joe Biden and State Department official Victoria Nuland leading the way. And these two are, in fact, still running Ukraine policy now from within the Biden administration. So, in your view, sir, what is the real story of the Ukraine government since the 2014 Maidan coup?
Yeah, there's two things to say. The first one is the actual events from 2013 into 2014, which ended up with a change of regime in February 2014. I think a lot of evidence has come out, even more than when I first or finally revised the book 2015, 2016, about the actual events on the Maidan. Plenty of excellent scholars, Ivan Kachinovsky, others, have forensically identified the actual sequence of events, including the shooting in the days from the up to the 20th, 21st of February that year. And they demonstrated that the shooting came from parts of the square and buildings around it, which were occupied by the demonstrators, the insurgents, call them what you like. So, in other words, it was a type of false flag event, and that's quite enormous. We not only their evidence of these scholars, but also the fact that the Ukrainian government has not proceeded in all the years, even before the war, with prosecutions about who was responsible amongst the Berkut, allegedly, is implicit or evidence to say that these scholars who argue it was a false flag are correct. This doesn't deny the fact that the Maidan itself was a complex event. Many layers were involved. And one of them, which one has to give recognition to, was the aspiration for a cleaner and better government, one which I fully endorse. I don't think that was a way of going about it, but it was certainly that aspiration and need because, then and of course before the war, Ukraine had become the poorest country in Europe. Standards of living, perhaps the figures don't reflect the reality, but nevertheless, its GDP per capita was remarkably low. That's the first thing to say that it was a complex event, and I think that the Western vision of the Euromaidan, the revolution of dignity, presents a distorted picture of what happened. Second, what did happen was that the balance within Ukraine shifted dramatically. I don't know whether you've spoken or had a chance to look at a book by Nikolai Petro called The Tragedy of Ukraine. And he puts it, building on and developing our work, about the division within Ukraine between, on the one side, the Galician nationalist vision of Ukrainian development, compared to what he calls the Malorus vision, that is, the Russophone vision of a multicultural, inclusive, tolerant, generous vision. Yes, I will accept that the Galician version, at times, at best, does have a civic vision of Ukraine developing, but it's always based on exclusion, partiality, division. Whereas the Malorus idea, at best, is also just to take pride in the character of the Ukrainian state, made up of many different parts, different peoples. And I've always argued that this vision, a pluralistic vision of a multicultural, multi-dimensional Ukraine, including in foreign policy, would have been far better. Since 2014, we've had a single, one-dimensional, the Galicians won, and they've been consolidating their victory ever since. And it's been a catastrophe for Ukraine, for Europe, for Russia, and the world.
You've written several books on Vladimir Putin, personally, about him. And of course, he is now portrayed in the West as the epitome of evil and the head of a dictatorial government, committed to reviving the Soviet Union. Who is the real character and what does Putin aspire to?
I think, a complex political phenomenon, but I will immediately argue that the idea that Putin is intent today on re-establishing some sort of Soviet empire is completely mistaken. My understanding of this war, and I'm willing to open and debate many aspects of it, is that it was provoked by an intensifying security dilemma. It's been one which was already identified by Gorbachev and then Yeltsin in the 1990s, whereby the expanding, NATO is only one part of it, but an expansive political West against Russia. Putin himself began as a very, perhaps the most pro-Western leader Russia has ever had. Some of your viewers, listeners, may have watched a marvelous video by Vladimir Pozner. He was a very well-known broadcaster in the late Soviet years during Perestroika. And this is his speech to Yale University in, I think, 2007. Well, later, but talking about, basically he said, and the speech is called How the West Made Putin, basically arguing that this pro-Western person who understood the security dilemma of NATO enlargement, and in fact, as you know, in a famous interview with David Frost, Putin was asked by David Frost, in the year 2000, can Russia join NATO? And Putin said, "I почему нет?" And why not? And the idea being that if NATO enlarges, there would inevitably be sooner or later a new type of iron curtain between its leading edge and those excluded, obviously Russia itself. So, so Putin has a complex political mentality. I will say that since 2012, when he came back for his third term, that clearly domestic politics has taken quite a sharp authoritarian turn. That in part this was provoked by the growing complexity and contradictions with the political West, but not entirely. And in fact, the two fed on each other, this sort of political West expanding, Russia becoming more authoritarian. And it was led to what I argue, certainly in the political West, is a hermetic type of politics, closure. The fact that the inability to listen, not even anymore talking about empathy, let alone sympathy, but an inability to listen to the concerns of others. You don't even necessarily have to agree with Russia's view that NATO enlargement was a danger. I mean, I think it was perceived as a threat. And as any realist scholar of international politics will say, it's the perceptions that matter as much as fact. I mean, I actually also think in factual terms, there was an implicit threat, obviously. But so, in other words, I don't, Moscow has to be responsible for its own actions, and so, but for us as scholars and as observers, it's a situation which we analyze neither to endorse nor to condemn, but to understand how we got into this extraordinary mess and how we basically forced or made Putin into an enemy where he could have been a good ally and a good friend.
The greatest fear amongst the Anglo-American oligarchy is that Russia and China will fully join forces and, as they often say, take away the nations of the global South from us. Their view is that these countries belong to us. The former colonies are again being treated as colonies. But what is the character of the growing cooperation between Russia and China, and what do you see as the role of the Belt and Road Initiative within that cooperation?
Well, certainly to start with, the Belt and Road Initiative, already some $100 billion has been dedicated to it in various schemes. It's a transformative vision of development and global development with China at the center. Of course, these things have a geopolitical edge to them, but above all, it's a sign of China becoming a mature power and with the resources to provide development aid to the rest of the world. Some of it may have been ill-advised investments, say the ports in Sri Lanka, but above all, I think that much Western criticism, debt trap diplomacy is a way of being. It's potentially a huge boon to development, global development, to alleviate poverty, to support education, and so on. But of course, it's embedded in that larger dysfunction, which is we are seeing the emergence of a new pattern in global politics. On the one side, we have, I use this term, the political West, you may have noticed earlier. By the political West, I don't mean the cultural West. This is the West with its roots back in Greece, in Greek tragedy, even Greek culture, Roman law, and Christendom, and so on, or even the civilizational West, which is that 500 years of Western colonialism, imperialism, occupation in Latin America, North America, etc. The political West is a function, a political body, political entity that took shape during the Cold War. It's the Trumanite state. It's militaristic, it's expansionist, it's hermetic. As I said, it cannot listen to views from outside. There's plenty of good things in it, you could say, that Wilsonian idealism at its best, but at its worst, we've seen a succession of wars from Vietnam onwards, and earlier, of course, interventions. So this political West is now balanced by what we could see the embryonic emergence of a political East. That is Russia and China together. Also, certain allies in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Also, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who, there's tensions between them all, yet this political East is beginning to emerge, not simply as the analog of the political West. That's quite important, because the political East precisely repudiates the bloc politics, the militarism, and so on of the political West. So it offers, like the Belt and Road Initiative, an alternative model of global politics. Now, I'm not saying that they are without blemish and without sin, but I am saying that potentially within the framework of the political East, which includes, for example, certain fundamental principles. I have in mind the Bandung Declaration of 1955 as developed in 1960, or the non-aligned movement. It also has a strong developmental edge. We don't have to fully buy into some of the slogans, win-win situations, a community of common destiny, these Chinese foreign policy slogans. I think they're important. I think they do mean something, but they they offer an alternative to that political West. It's not simply a question of authoritarianism versus democracy. And I was going to say another principle in the political East is the ASEAN tradition of non-bloc politics, of sovereign internationalism. Sovereignty will develop in our own pace, our own way, but we're internationalists at the same time, as opposed to the political West, which is developing, what I nowadays call a type of democratic internationalism. The view that if you're not a democracy, you are an outsider, and at worst, right for regime change. Now, I'll condemn many of the authoritarian systems in across the world, but I think that the way to work with them is within the framework of the UN Charter, as I think we've talked about our earlier time, that declaration of 4th of February 2021, where Russia and China vigorously restated the fundamental principles of the Charter international system, of the UN system, and the centrality of the UN. Now, that's political East and the political West. There's also the global South, which, of course, is now becoming a subject, as you suggested, for struggle between the two emerging. I won't call them blocks because the political East isn't quite analogous to the political West. Yet there is a tussle. We see it with the strong arm tactics by the US in voting patterns in the UN, in international organizations, and even the OSCE, which of course is a European body. But we see it everywhere. So that's in my view, the big picture at the moment.
So you're currently finishing a book, I understand, called Lost Peace, and one can speculate fairly easily on what that subject will be. But could you give us a sense of the theme and the intention of this new book?
Yes, it's called The Lost Peace, how we basically lost and squandered the opportunity at the end of the First Cold War, 1989-91, to establish a positive peace order. This is, in a sense, also underlines some of the talk in the political East. A positive peace order is more than just simply the absence of war. It's based on development, and not the negative peace, the absence of war. And of course, quite clearly, in 1989-91, with Gorbachev and his various ideas, his appeal to the United Nations, again, that Charter international system, we did have this moment, this opportunity, which, in my view, was mismanaged by the West, by its intention to expand its influence in some of the normative underpinnings of the political West are those I will fully support, insofar as they are in conformity with the United Nations and the Charter international system. But that also the Charter system is, as I say, based on sovereign internationalism. In short, we did have an opportunity, and in part the mistake from the West, in my view, was that they misunderstood Gorbachev's and the Soviet Union's, and indeed Russian foreign policy until 2012 was basically within the framework of the Gorbachevian agenda of positive peace. And so Yeltsin's and Putin's foreign policy until that time was basically still in the belief that some sort of common European home could be established, that Europe could emerge from Vladivostok to Lisbon as an entity which, with challenges to overcome, with developmental issues to deal with all sorts of governance issues, but it could be done in that framework. Instead of which, Atlanticism won out quite explicitly to undermine any neo-Gaullist ideas of a pan-European and, of course, global peace order. So we squandered that opportunity. in many ways, it was quite clear that the political West after 1989 was not going to cede positions. We know about the Wolfowitz Doctrine of 1992, of doctrine of US supremacy, all of that. And so ultimately it skewed everything towards, once again, a negative peace and indeed war today.
Yeah. You published another book in 2021 titled Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War, which appears to be about the so-called political West in your term. Our EIR has published extensively on the role of British and American intelligence in setting up the lies about Russian subversion of the US elections and of their control over Donald Trump. What was your conclusion, and what was the deception that you referred to? And how do you think this contributed to the extreme danger of not just a new Cold War, but a full-scale US-NATO world war against Russia and China today?
Yeah, no, I think EIR is absolutely spot on in identifying Russiagate for those two elements you mentioned. First, that it was a massive act of deception. There's been no evidence, and in fact, it's more and more that we understand and have more data. We can see that, for example, Trump did not collude with Putin. That Russia, there's no evidence to this day. Proof that Russia was responsible for the hack of the Democratic National Committee, etc. That the role of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and all of that was literally as publisher. And Assange himself says it wasn't the Russians who gave it to him or even an intermediary. And the Christopher Steele dossier was being demonstrated to be completely false, and both in its form and in its sources. The Papadopoulos case, which EIR, and I know that your colleagues have looked at quite intensively. So it's quite clear it was a massive act of deception. But this wasn't just a deception on the American people. What it's actually done is poisoned and stymied and closed those opportunities to shift out of the Cold War mentality. And in fact, it intensified it. I mean, the first result, of course, of Russiagate was that it constrained Trump's opportunity for diplomatic maneuver. And in fact, he had to prove how tough he was against Russia. And of course, he did that, upping offensive arms sales to Ukraine and all the rest. So Russiagate is still in the underlying threnody, or the underlying refrain which got us into this war. The fact that it was a Democratic Party quite explicitly. And interestingly, many of the actors involved in that Russiagate deception are also involved in the anti-diplomacy which has led to this war. Above all, Jake Sullivan, Biden himself, Victoria Nuland. But Jake Sullivan in particular was quite explicitly propounding the Russiagate falsehoods as a way of an instrument of beating Trump, forcing him back into his corner, and quite explicitly use this as a political tool to hopefully to the Democrats' advantage. But what it has done, it has shown that particular elite constellation at the top of the Democratic Party today was so vested in militarism and NATO enlargement that once they took office, despite the talk of trying to balance relations, and indeed much talk about focusing on China rather than Russia, the Russiagate legacy blends into directly into this war.
And on the war, the greater war, which is now openly discussed everywhere, I think there is finally emerging a realization of the danger of a global war, potentially nuclear war, which the Washington, D.C. event yesterday I hope you had a chance to watch some of what took place at Lincoln Memorial yesterday on the rage against the war machine. Demonstrates that there is the emergence of a peace-orientated world. And more important even than the pro-peace orientation is the explicit denunciation of the right versus left, blue versus red, the divisions that are the core used by the oligarchy, keeping the population quarreling among itself rather than uniting against either the economic disintegration that's taking place across the Western world or against these wars, and especially the potential of a full-scale nuclear war. So this event yesterday, which had several thousand people and probably thousands more watching online, and several similar events planned for next weekend across Europe, in Germany and France. And then you have the UK. Now, the UK, as everybody knows, is now watching strike after strike, that almost the whole population is revolting against the extreme inflationary destruction of the standard of living across the country. But what level of protest do you think, well, let me ask first, how much popular opposition, like we saw yesterday, is required in order to break through the media control and the control of the media in shaping the acceptance of this division of the world into warring blocs? What's required?
I must say I very much laud the demonstrations yesterday in the US and the whole peace movements. As you say, it's more than just peace movements, but that an attempt to reset the terms of the debate. And we do know that there's what I've admired from a distance is the beginning of a mobilization in the US against militarism. It's not just this war, but the factors which led to this war being possible, and it's totally unnecessary, avoidable conflict. So that's very good. And as you mentioned, Germany, yes, there a few weeks ago, 10,000 protested. We have those marvelous speeches from Die Linke in the German parliament condemning this war, for example, calling for an investigation into the Nord Stream, blowing up the Nord Stream gas pipelines last September. But in the UK, this popular or organized resistance is minimal. We know that next week, the 25th of February, there was a plan, well, there is still a plan for a anti-war meeting, but the venue in which it was due to take place, in fact, the second one, Conway Hall, refused to allow them to meet there. So the actual venue of this meeting will only be announced on the eve of the meeting, so that they won't be able to have an injunction or some way or other to stop this meeting taking place. This is absolutely astonishing, far worse than anything that was seen in the first Cold War. The fact that they're physically now blocking meetings or anti-war or peace meetings in the UK. And of course, in part, that is the policy of the leadership of the Labour Party today, which, as you know, is going to prevent Jeremy Corbyn standing as a Labour candidate in the next general election here. At the same time, as I've been up and down the land talking to people, giving talks, there is a deep undercurrent of dissatisfaction against the militaristic language and looking for a way out of the war instead of just escalating, piling in the arms, etc. But how to organize this? That's the great problem for us. It's rather minimal. Yes, there is still the CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, European Nuclear Disarmament, but it's just a shadow of what it was in the 1980s. The fact that the Labour Party is not supporting it, and therefore, by extension, the trade unions are not providing a venue. We had meetings before in Congress House, which is the headquarters of the Trades Union Congress, years back, but that is no longer clearly available. I don't know the details. So your question is a fundamental one. And one could say that, like the opposition to the Vietnam War, it takes quite a time before the anti-war movement in the US, elsewhere, really gained momentum. So we are in the early stages, I think, at this stage, at this moment. It will build, it will develop. And I think that, in part determined by events on the battlefield, but also in a general sense about the futility of escalation in this very dangerous context.
Let me add a question that I hadn't sent to you earlier. On the question of the battlefield, what's your reading on the often discussed offensive from Russia, which was at first talked about to come at the winter when the ground was frozen and so on, and now is often discussed as something coming in the spring? Do you have a reading on that?
Well, I've been reading contradictory information, but I think the general consensus amongst those who really know what they're talking about, rather than propagandists from one side or the other, is that Russia is quite clearly, the Russian forces, the Russian army today, is very different from the one that launched the invasion in February last year. That it's now mobilized far more effectively, it's organized, it's armed, it's now got the reserves and the adequate forces. And whether this offensive takes place sooner or later, it's poised, it's very different from what it was. It's moved, it's armored. I don't want to go into all the details. I've been looking at this from various perspectives. It also is inflicting massive damage on Ukrainian forces, its artillery and infantry. Russia does have air dominance, air force dominance largely. So the way almost certainly will be, either in a continuing war of attrition, because at the moment it's quite clear that Ukraine, in its defense of Bakhmut, is a type of, perceived from Kiev, it's a type of Stalingrad. That if they lose Bakhmut, they lose the whole defensive key on the Donetsk front, and it may lead to a very swift unraveling. So, it's the talk of the Russian army losing and failing, I think, is overdrawn. Yes, they've had enormous difficulties, many questions, for example, why they use the Wagner forces rather than a regular military in Bakhmut. But, this could be, the tactic seems to be, and there was a mini offensive on the Zaporozhye front a few weeks ago. What they're doing is testing the forces. They're sending them forwards, getting a bit, battle hardening them, then taking them back, and then rotating the forces, and also as well on towards Sumy, Kharkov. So everything is saying that Russia is not even planning perhaps an immediate full-scale offensive, but a gradual war of attrition. And Russia can see this through the long term. They're talking about a long war. And even if the West sends its Leopard tanks and even the F-16s, Russia has the ability. It spent the last 20 years preparing, how to destroy Challenger tanks, how to destroy Abrams tanks, how to destroy Leopard 2 tanks, how to destroy Leclerc tanks. They've got the technology, and it's a dreadful situation. But Russia will it's extremely. Who can tell on the battlefield? It's extremely unlikely that it will lose the battle, that it will advance incrementally, and ultimately, this is a war that Ukraine and the West cannot win, and that we will quite likely, sooner or later, see an Afghan Vietnam style debacle.
Well, let me switch gears a bit and ask you an historical question, if I may, going back to the era of Khrushchev. As you know, as is well known, JFK and his brother Bobby were able to rein in the Warhawks, first on the Bay of Pigs, but then with the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was able to rein in the Warhawks, but also was carrying out a secret back channel negotiation with the Soviet Union, with the assistance from the Vatican, to prevent that incident from turning into what could very well have been a global nuclear war. How did Khrushchev deal with the Warhawks on the Soviet side at that time? And do you think that has any implications for the current situation?
Well, certainly on the US side, there was a far more dynamic situation than there is today. He also, Kennedy, had the representative in the United Nations who was working and talking with the Russians. He was also visiting the Russian embassy, can you believe? Dobrynin was the Soviet ambassador. So there were all sorts of things going on. And of course, Kennedy was chastened by the failure of the Bay of Pigs and all the excessive promises the military had told him about this, planned invasion of Cuba. As for the Soviet Union, clearly a different position, because Politburo system. We do know that there had been voices who had raised concern about it in the first place, and of course, this is in the context of the Berlin Wall having gone up the previous year, the U2 crisis the year before, the general sense that the Soviet Union knew perfectly well that it didn't have what Kennedy said was a missile. It didn't have many missiles. We know this from the Oleg Penkovsky papers, the spy who gave a lot of information to the West. And so the West knew also, by the way, that Russia was much weaker. The Soviet Union was much weaker in terms of nuclear forces. But what this does show today is that almost none of this, the idea of any American official today visiting the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. with Anatoly Antonov is just simply out of the question. Even during Russiagate, the Russian ambassador was talking to Michael Flynn and others. The idea Russiagate has closed those diplomatic options and those back channel. So the legacy, the awful, dangerous legacy of Russiagate impinges and affects across a whole spectrum of behaviors and has closed down and, of course, led to the demonization of Russia. Really, if Russia had done what it was accused of doing, no country likes another power to intervene in their elections. Of course, the US does it quite normally, but it's, no country particularly likes it. So it's poisoned everything. So indeed, in my view, this is a slow motion Cuban Missile Crisis. Without the adroit leadership of the Kennedy brothers, as you say, and indeed Khrushchev, who was using this as a bargaining counter. They felt, if the US can put missiles in Turkey, the Jupiter missiles, well, we should do this. And it was a sign of weakness, of course, and which was exposed. And then Khrushchev was ousted a couple of years later.
Mm. The introduction to your book, Frontline Ukraine, which is the only part I've read of the book, actually, I have to admit. But it's a very interesting discussion about your Polish heritage and the fact that your father was a participant in World War II in the Polish army, including time served in what is now part of Ukraine, but which at the time was under Polish control. With that in mind, how do you look at the current role of Poland, which is in the lead of the war party crowd, and the anti-Russia war mobilization? And how do you think the Polish people see that policy, which is now being carried out by Duda and their government?
I'll start on that second point because it helps a lot. I received, when this war began, many messages from Polish friends and even people whom I didn't know but who knew I was interested in this. And they were saying that what to do. And of course, I said, well, support Ukrainian refugees. They are as innocent as as anyone else, and so obviously you should. But there is this undercurrent within Poland which is resistant to that militarism. But the leadership in Poland, it's clearly it's gone on a how can I put it, a dangerous loop beyond, it's back to the 1930s and the mismanagement of Polish security concerns way back then. Beck, who was the foreign minister, the agreements with Nazi Germany, believing that Nazi Germany was going to be a better security option than the Soviet Union. Well, you can understand why they had concerns about the Soviet Union, especially after the military purges and, of course, the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. But today, the extremism of the Polish elite is so beyond the pale. For example, the former Polish defense minister, way back in 2016, I spoke with him and I heard he said the same thing again. This is a fellow called Bici. He said that Putin is worse. This is 2016. Putin is worse than Hitler. Now, any state who could make that sort of statement cannot be treated with respect or any sense of measure whatsoever. And of course, it was those attitudes, this failure for Poland and the Baltic republics to overcome their historic grievances. Now, they've got legitimate grievances. You talk about my father. My father nearly was captured by the Soviet forces when they invaded on the 17th of September, 1939. It was his colleagues, Polish army reservists, and my father was an agronomist, and he was called up and he fought in the reserve, and that's what he was doing in Grodno and Lvov before the war. That he was nearly captured and, of course, murdered. His colleagues were murdered at Katyn and the other death sites. So, he, if anyone, had a grievance, yet he never was, virulently anti-Soviet. And of course, he always spoke for reconciliation and overcoming these historic divisions. And the tragedy of our time is that the European Union ended up amplifying these genuine grievances rather than overcoming them. And this is why the European Commission today, under Ursula von der Leyen, is taking the lead. Now we're talking about the 10th package of sanctions. And at no point are they saying, look, these sanctions are against the elite or against such like, there's no sense that we'll try to avoid the Russian people suffering. This language, again, has disappeared. It's the degradation and the coarsening of discourse. And much of this has come from Poland and the Baltic republics, right from the beginning, who take an essentialist view of Russia. You began with the question about the discussion about Russia trying to reestablish its empire. And they assume there's endless continuity, and they're simply not taking into account the contingency and the genuine dynamics within Russian society, the changes that have taken place, and even within the elite itself.
We're also waging a fight over the sanctions against Syria, which we've been battling since they were implemented over a decade ago. But especially since the earthquake, the fact that they have refused to lift the sanctions, which is preventing a huge portion of what would be coming into the country to deal with this absolute disaster. It among other things, demonstrates what we've always known, which is that the sanctions are not, as they claim to be, aimed against the policies of governments, but they're aimed directly against the populations. It's the populations that get stricken by these sanctions policies. And in the case of the earthquake, it could very well cost thousands of innocent lives. So that then begs the question of the sanctions regime, the thousands of sanctions being imposed throughout the world by the US, with the Europeans basically going along with most of that. What's your reading on the impact of the massive sanctions against Russia, both on Russia itself, but also the impact of that upon Europe, especially, but really the whole world?
Yeah. I just say a word about the Syrian sanctions, the so-called Caesar sanctions intensifying. You mentioned them going on for a long time, but 2020, these absolutely punitive sanctions were effectively directed against the Syrian people who had suffered already nearly a decade of war and suffering. It was one of the cruelest acts, in my life. It was just piling on. It was equivalent to the sanctions imposed on Cambodia or on Vietnam after Vietnam had invaded Cambodia to get rid of that monstrous Pol Pot regime. Again, pure geopolitics, pure, vindictiveness. And against this, again, this is being shown vis-a-vis Russia. For example, the fact that flights are banned from Russia to most destinations is just, again, absolutely astonishing. The elite, the top people, the so-called oligarchs, Putin's cronies, have private jets, planes. They could go anywhere they like if anybody's going to take them. But, these flights, the ban on flights, has never been done on a major country before. It means that, grandmother can't see grandchild, that families can't go back, and so on. This is absolutely attack on the population. And what the effect has been, it has been a realization by Russia that this is a war not just against the Putin regime, it's a war against the Russian people. They, again, like the Syrian sanctions, totally counterproductive, vindictive, punitive, and of course, they're not going to work. Russia is a far bigger country, and it's got its own resources. It also has friends. I actually think it's not excluded. You asked about China. We've already seen indications that China may so far it's given diplomatic coverage under the guise of neutrality, may actually support, because Russia's defeat by the West, especially after the shooting down of those balloons and that extraordinary rhetoric against China, is almost forcing Russia and China together at the moment, and of course Iran and some other countries. So its effect, of course, has been devastating. I mentioned the explosions, the destruction of Nord Stream pipelines, the gas pipelines, which of course was effectively a massive blow against Germany, because the United States has been opposed to the energy relationship between Russia and Western Europe since the 1960s, when it was first mooted. Astonishing. So many of us would argue, well, what's the United States got to do with it? You deal with your energy issues, we'll deal with ours. But of course, it means that the United States can now sell its LNG, liquefied natural gas, for 4 times the price, if not more, of the what used to be a cheap gas from Russia. So its effect, of course, has been devastating. I've just had a workman in today, and he was complaining about a 4-fold increase in his energy costs. So it's been absolutely devastating. And of course, we've had a relatively mild winter in Western Europe this year. I don't know how it's been in the US, but the energy crisis is far from over. And I think that many people anticipate next year is going to be the crunch time. So we're headed perhaps for even worse times in terms of energy costs than we have today.
The Russians and the Chinese together are also putting together a new financial structure. I mean, the Russians were forced to do so when they were thrown out of the SWIFT, and their reserves were stolen outright, and so forth. But but together and actually expanding to a collaboration with almost all the BRICS countries. They're talking about putting together a new trade currency, a currency based, in fact, on policies presented by Lyndon LaRouche to his friend Glaziev in Russia way back in the year 2000, to have trade without currency, or rather a basket of commodity-based, a commodity package as a basis for valuing the trade between countries, not replacing their national currencies for internal use, but for international trade and relations. And almost all the global South and others are trying to get out from under the use of the dollar, since the US uses the fact that the dollar is used in trade as their justification for their sanctions. So everybody is sort of bolting to get out. Have you followed this development of the Glaziev policies towards some sort of a new structure for international trade and development?
Oh, indeed, yes. There's an accelerating process of de-dollarization, because the United States, as you suggest, has weaponized the dollar. And of course, this is a double-edged sword, because it means that the dollar then, if it's an instrument of pressure, one form or another, then obviously countries will learn. And this is now accelerated since the impounding. So far, they haven't quite yet stolen the Russian reserves. And of course, the headline figure is $300 billion of the central bank of Russia's reserves held in the West. I think that the figure probably, because Russia has managed to do all sorts of things, I think it may turn out to be only 35 billion. But nevertheless, the principle is the same, that that the West feels that it could perhaps use this money, take this money, as they did with the Afghan state banks' reserves held in the United States. So indeed, I think there's de-dollarization going on, the establishment of alternatives, as you say, the yuan trade, the rupee trade, and mutual trade. There's also talk of mutually a joint work on some sort of digital currency. Now, that's more complex because it's difficult to know the value of a digital currency and whether it can hold its value because of the enormous volatility. But they are talking, the Central Bank of Russia and the Chinese Central Bank are, working, is just working parties on this. So absolutely, the dollar won't be displaced in any time soon. However, it's the direction of movement which is important. And the fact that, of course, China is alarmed by the extraordinary ineptitude of US policymakers vis-a-vis Taiwan, which clearly the provocative acts vis-a-vis Taiwan, Nancy Pelosi visiting last summer, and then a congressional delegation soon afterwards, and the various talk, means that if a crisis did get sharpened, then China and the rest of the world is looking at what the political West has done to Russia, and they're obviously going to take counter action. So, and this new trading currency is one of those very important developments.
So, to conclude, let me ask specifically about. I believe you followed the work of Executive Intelligence Review for many years. You may or may not have seen Helga Zepp LaRouche's recent call of what she called 10 principles for a new architecture of development and security, where the idea is to address the lack of principle in the way people think about things, to address the lack of thinking about fundamental principles in our thinking, but rather accepting sort of a defined, controlled debate between left, right, or red, blue, or whatever, but rather to address the principles needed of eliminating global poverty, for instance, and global education. The last principle, the 10th principle in her list, is to return to the classical principle that man is fundamentally good, and doing away with the ability of demonizing the people you have differences with, which of course is central to the Russiagate and to all the other operations. So I wondered if you could comment on that, your view of the work that we've accomplished over these years and the principles that we're fighting for.
One of the things which I like about Schiller Institute and your general position is, in addition to what you've just said, is the belief that technology is a fantastic tool in the service of humanity, and that we shouldn't be frightened of, for example, nuclear power used in an effective and intelligent manner, and of course small modular reactors. That technology, when it's purely used, how can I put it, used, can be damaging and exploitatively. But I mean, I do think that the development of infrastructure, again, when environmental concerns, high-speed railways, connectivity, there's huge resources of human ingenuity that, and including dealing with issues of climate change, where I know that I actually do think that climate change is a major threat. I'm not sure that this is a position that is shared. But irrespective of that, even though it's difficult to put that to one side, it's that I agree completely that we do need, and this is where I do agree with EIR and Schiller, a new peace agenda, and this is possible, and that we really do have to have this, an optimism that humans can do better. Instead of which, we've become locked in this Cold War mentality, this Manichaean mentality. Much of it is driven by our failure to overcome that first Cold War. We have in the United States, the Trumanite state, that militarism, which is simply out of control, and it's stopping investment in US infrastructure and all of those social developmental needs. And too often, even US aid, which is much of it is good, but so much is tied to geopolitical objectives. And of course, today, our most urgent necessity is peace. And that's why I'm very happy to work with the Schiller Institute, with you, with our colleagues in Australia, with EIR, because you have a consistent position for peace. And that really is important. And it's not just an abstract, it's grounded on a very carefully considered anti-militaristic positions. It isn't so it isn't just a vague desire, but it's a thought out, principled position, and it's one in most respects of development, using science for human progress, one that I share.
Well, I think the 10,000 in Munich and the several thousand yesterday in Washington are at least a hopeful sign that idea is taking hold, and that people are recognizing that they have to, in Helga Zeppler-Rouche's term, she said, every single person on Earth is challenged by the threat of a nuclear war, and therefore every single person has to see themselves as a world citizen. And that we have to, she comes from Trier, the hometown of Karl Marx, but she says, world citizens unite.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. Let's do it.
Do you have any last thoughts?
No, I think that's a very important point to talk, because clearly the Ukraine war is in danger of escalating. So we all have a responsibility to try to halt the march to madness.
Yeah. Well, I thank you very much. This will have a good impact globally, I'm sure. and I appreciate your input.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.